Hello and welcome to the latest edition of E+T Off the Page. Today we're discussing why public opinion and developing the built environment are so often at odds with each other. On one hand, important infrastructure projects can be delayed or cancelled to the detriment of the national interest. Or alternatively, communities have huge housing schemes imposed on them that they didn't want. And as we're going to discuss today, can honest, open communication result in a better outcome for all parties? I'm Tim Fry, and as always, I have my editorial colleagues Jack Loughran and Tanya Weaver here in the studio. And we're also joined by Oliver Deed, who is co-founder of ECF. ECF stands for Engage, Communicate, Facilitate, which is a communications and engagement consultancy, working typically on built environment and active transport projects. So, welcome Ollie, and I guess the theme of our discussion today is basically that it's good to talk, and by implication, it's something that we're not very good at.
It is good to talk. I would argue we are very good at it, or some of us are very good at it anyway. So, more generally in the built environment, my observation has been over the last 15 years that developers in particular are not particularly good at engaging and talking to communities. Now, there are some honourable exceptions to that rule. And I do think that's one of the reasons why we're in a housing crisis at the moment, because if you look at opinion polling on trust in developers, in 2019, Grosvenor did an opinion poll on trust in developers in this country, and 2% of the population said that they trusted developers to do the right thing. That environment has sort of bred a very adversarial approach to the way that we do infrastructure planning, how we do planning on the built environment. And we sort of sit at the interface of that, doing public consultation, public participation work. And to be quite frank, I don't think we are, as an industry, that good at talking, particularly to the public.
Okay, well, we'll come back to the trust element later on, perhaps. But just to clarify your role, you are appointed on behalf of the development, whatever sort of development that might be. So does that mean that you are effectively there to sell the project?
So we're not always appointed by the developer, I hasten to add. So sometimes we're appointed by local authorities to work on projects. So there is a bit of a different dynamic for those types of projects. But when we work for developers, we're paid by developers, so people can read into that what they like. But I generally see our role as doing two things. One is to make sure that the development is understood by the community, so taking very complex concepts and translating them into very simple language for people to understand, because Joe Public doesn't know a huge amount about planning or any of the technical stuff that we talk about on a day-to-day basis. So we do our best to try and make sure that members of the public understand what's going on, which allows them to do the second thing that we're really encouraging, which is to get the public to feed into the projects and to help shape the projects that we're working on. So we as a business actually have adopted this philosophy, which is that we believe that every individual, no matter what their background, has both the ability and the right to shape positive change within their community. So that basically means we try to construct campaigns for developers that allow communities to have a genuine input into the projects that we're working on.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking back in time, Britain's always been the heart of industrialization, and it's been home to the first railway, the first tube system, all this kind of stuff. I mean, even into the 50s and 60s, you got the build out of motorways and roads all over the country. And it makes me think, why has things changed? Because we used to be such a leader in terms of building out infrastructure. Is that because people have become more opposed to it as time's gone on? Or is it because we used to just build willy-nilly through poor neighborhoods and not really care what people thought? And now there's possibly, things have possibly flipped the other way, where actually we care too much what local communities think.
I think there is one obvious thing there, Jack, and that's we used to have 40-odd million people in the country with no motor cars, and now we've got 70 million in the UK with 2 or 3 cars per family, and that's just a massive amount of infrastructure, isn't it? What do you think, Ollie? And on the broader point there, have we changed in our attitude?
So I take your point on population increase and the car ownership levels. the thing that I'd say, I forget now what the figure is of how much of land in England is actually developed at the moment, but it's some absurdly low figure, a single digit figure. So people have this. I did this with my friends in the pub once. I asked them, how much of England do you think is developed? And they were saying, as in has housing on it, they think it's 40, 50, 60%. In reality, it's about 7 or 8%. So my actual theory is that one of the reasons why housing is so difficult to build now is that as a result of reform in the 80s, home ownership levels went up. And actually, what we find in the data is that people who own homes have less of a propensity to support new development coming forward because they have a vested, or they feel that they have a vested interest in keeping the stock of housing low to maintain high house prices, to put it as crudely as possible. So that makes development quite difficult. On infrastructure, it's a much more complex situation. But if you take say Heathrow, for instance, we may talk about Heathrow in a minute, but the airport's built, and what's happened around the airport is that you've had more and more housing built around it, and therefore there's more and more people to object to any development that you do in that particular area. So I think it's a bit of a cultural shift that's been fueled by the economics of the housing market predominantly. So I don't think it's got a huge amount to do with population. It's more to do about the profile of that population.
Yeah, there seems to be a willingness for people to complain about stuff. Makes me laugh when you have somebody who moves into a house next to a pub, and then they start complaining about the noise in the pub next door, and you blow that up to Heathrow scale, and people know there's an airport there already.
Just to add to that, like that's actually causing a major problem in central London because, I mean, they talk about the death of nightlife in places like Soho, which is in fact we're recording right now. And it's basically because, a bunch of wealthy QCs have moved into Soho Square and are getting pissed off that the bars are making noise after 10 p.m. And it's like, I mean, why? Like, surely we shouldn't let people move into a place that is renowned to be the central hub of nightlife and then complain to the point where they actually shut down what is almost like an important cultural part of London's central districts.
So in the context of this conversation, is that too much communication, Ollie? Or do we not want these people to communicate?
I can't say that because I'd be out of a job. But on major infrastructure projects, my general feeling, and Tanya, you might disagree. It sounds like you might do. That there's probably a bit too much communication goes on. Like if you look at the two major infrastructure projects that are quite high in the public consciousness, you look at HS2. You've had an act of parliament for however many years, and there's still wrangling going on as to what's happening with that project. Not just fueled actually by public objection to the scheme, but also the public finances and a whole host of other reasons. But the public objection to the scheme is a big reason why politicians haven't made that decision.
Well, I'm just going to jump in now because I live in Warwick, which is right by HS2, and it's totally cut up Warwickshire landscape.
Yeah.
And there is an area of getting from where I live to Kenilworth. The A46 is down to like one lane as they swung that huge bridge across.
Yeah.
And it is just causing mayhem. There is an issue with it. Like, it just doesn't feel right because it's expensive, and it's like, who's it going to benefit? And we are all up in arms about it, to be honest.
They haven't made a good case for it. They've sort of oscillated between we need high-speed rail and it's a capacity issue, and the initial justification for it has. So I can understand why you, as a resident, would be upset.
Yeah, and I came in today on Chiltern Line, which took me an hour and 20 minutes, and it's totally fine.
Yeah.
Why do people need to get to Birmingham 15 minutes quicker?
I know, it's nuts.
But that wasn't the argument. The argument was, or should have been, and I don't know how well they put it across, it should have been about capacity.
Yeah.
If you can start getting a lot of people moving quickly, then that really makes a difference to the economy of the Midlands and the North.
They built it the wrong way. They should have probably built the Leeds to Birmingham or, the Manchester. They probably should have focused their energy in terms of rail investment in, those northern parts rather than start in London and build out. But the way that business cases are done in the Treasury, you need to get returns on investment, and that means that investing in London becomes the obvious thing to do.
Yeah.
So
It escalated the costs because you had, environmental groups. My friend there's an ancient forest, and then you had all the bats that had to be taken care of.
tunnel or whatever it is.
Yeah, so it was just more and more cost.
You have to crack a few eggs to make an omelette, though.
So at what stage, if we go go back to the way that things should be organised, what stage should developer or local authority or government, who I'll keep calling them developer as an umbrella expression, what stage should the developer involve the community? Should it be at the formation of plans, or is it better for them to have some sort of watertight plan that they can present to the public, which will have most of the questions answered?
Good question. It does slightly depend, in my view, on the scale of the scheme. And we've got this term that we use called the scope of influence. So what that means is that realistically, what can the community actually influence on a project moving forward? So on large scale master plans, for instance, we're working on a scheme for 5,600 new homes in northeast Cambridge. And on that project, we were brought in very, very early, and we've done 3 years of public engagement and communication on that project because there was latitude, because the developer was willing to listen to the community and actually shape some of the plans around the aspirations of the community. So if you're working on a project where there's a genuine scope of influence for the community, bring people in early to do the communications and get people, not with a blank sheet of paper, because it's never like that, but get them engaging in the process. If you're bringing forward a development that's constrained by policy or by the commercials or by the planning context or whatever it might be, and is really tightly bound, there's absolutely no point bringing people like us in really early, or getting comms out really, really early, because ultimately you've got nothing really to engage or consult on. You get to the point where you formulate your plans, you communicate out what your plans are, and then you do the exercise before submitting a planning application. So it does depend on one, the scale of the scheme, and two, the actual scope of influence that the community has on the project.
How do you think you balance the fact that, I mean, when you're talking about community voices, it's not like every community has one unified voice and the government has another one. I mean, for example, I cycle everywhere, and I have done basically since I was a teenager. And in that time, I've seen cycle infrastructure slowly improve kind of all across London. Lots of the worst places that I used to cycle through are now perfectly passable as a cyclist. And, I'm very pro that. But drivers, people who love driving everywhere, are not in favor of that, frankly, because building out cycling infrastructure often means taking a lane away from a road and possibly slowing traffic down. And suddenly someone's got to spend an extra 5 minutes getting to work and back every day, which maybe I say it slightly flippantly, but that's 10 minutes a day. If you're driving to work 5 days a week, that's nearly an hour. And then that builds up and up, and it does frustrate people. And I get that. So how do you balance the kind of the difference in opinion between, say, cyclists and drivers, or people who want low traffic neighborhoods versus people that want to just be able to kind of quickly zip from place to place?
And is there a changed attitude as well in that as well? Is this active transport, people and maybe local governments far more open to that, and they've demonized the driver a lot more these days?
Oh, that's loaded terminology. Yeah, I'm gonna to use a cricketing analogy, let that one through to the keeper, I think. But it's really difficult. There's no formula for it. But generally, on active travel, you've got national priorities. So the government are very signed up to encouraging more people to walk and cycle. That filters down to local authority level. So generally, every local authority will have a walking and cycling action plan or something similar, which encourages what they call modal shift, so get people out of the cars and into sort of the walking and cycling. Then in terms of the actual design of individual schemes, there are various different approaches that you can take in terms of how you engage people on them. So we've worked with some local authorities where they've actually brought us in quite early stages to try to co-design an intervention with the local community, and that intervention aligns with their policy objective, right? So whenever people in a local community say we don't want this infrastructure, the reality is that the local authority have set a very clear policy direction, and if people don't like that, they can vote that administration out at the next election.
Well, just the problem with that though is that infrastructure projects take years to build, and sure, you can vote someone out, but I mean, firstly, that administration might have been in place for 4 years and it's kind of too late because you're halfway through by that point. And secondly, don't we need a kind of a constant we need a sense of direction. And actually, if you've got, say, I mean, I'm not even suggesting that this is the way it is, but imagine Labour are super pro cycling all the
Yeah.
time and the Tories are always super pro driving. Like, infrastructure takes longer than the 5-year parliamentary terms that we abide by. So, like, how can you balance our kind of short-term thinking potentially in the political system with more long-term thinking when it comes to infrastructure?
Well, walking and cycling, actually, the infrastructure could be put in quite quickly. So the way that schemes are designed, it tends to be smaller schemes get put into places to, you might have a series of, say, cycling corridors you're going to put into the borough, but you don't do the whole cycling corridor. You do bits and pieces as you go along, as you've probably seen where you live, that's the case. So actually things can be done quite quickly. I mean, my preference, and this is something that we've tried to encourage clients to do, is to use what we call deliberative democracy as a way to, so using devices like citizens' assemblies, citizens' panels to get an input into the formation of policies that come forward within a community. And what that means is you get a demographically representative sample of the community together to discuss different issues. So you could put a low traffic neighborhood to a citizens panel, a demographically representative group of the community, and get them to effectively deliberate or discuss all of the major issues, and then make a series of recommendations that go into the council either for approving or not. And you could do that in a local community area, and that's the system that we think would help solve some of the problems that you're talking about.
But isn't there an issue with that where, frankly, it tends to be that, more middle class neighborhoods tend to sort of be more representative when it comes to local action.
Yeah.
And actually people, living in large council estates tend to be less present in those things.
So, good question. Get it all the time.
Okay.
So the idea is that it's done through what's called a sortition process. So it's about random selection. So, for instance, if you're looking to get a panel of 18 people together that's demographically representative, you would put, say, 2,000 letters out to the community and then ask people to apply to participate. The kicker, and the reason why you get people from all types of socioeconomic backgrounds involved, is because you pay them to participate. And I think that's absolutely crucial now. So we did a co-design project in a suburb of East London that is it's quite high on the multiple indices of deprivation. So exactly the profile of community you're talking about, and we got really good participation levels. And the reason why was because we pay people £40 a session to come and spend their time with us. So I think that's a big part of what people need to do moving forwards in engagement, is actually remunerate people for their time so that you get a wider cross-section of people participating in the process. So fair question, though.
And with these panels, would they be set up by the developer, the council, whatever, to deal with a specific project? Or would they be set up as part of the council and sort of like a public voice of that council for all sorts of issues?
You could do it either way. So the citizens' assemblies that have happened at the local authority level have tended to happen on climate change, for instance, recently. So Camden, I'm going to miss them, so I won't list them all, but there's lots of local authorities that have done this, and you've done some really effective work on, a major policy initiative from their perspective. So you could do it that way. We've convened these panels on individual projects on behalf of developers, and we get great levels of participation, really good outcomes. Developers really like them. So there's all manner of different ways that you can do it.
Could you give us an example, one of these projects that you've engaged with?
So going back to that master plan that I talked about, 5,600 new homes in northeast Cambridge, we convened with a great developer called Town and Landsec as well. It's called the Ideas Exchange. So it's 18 demographically representative members of the northeast Cambridge community that for the last 3 years had met and have been paid to participate in a series of meetings to discuss some of the key parameters surrounding that particular project. So things like public spaces, what should we be doing with public spaces? What should we be doing with, the density of the housing? What should the community facilities look like? Those types of questions. And the project team have used that as a really good sounding board to test ideas and to get genuine representative feedback into that particular process. So that's one example. I talked about the one in East London as well, and we're looking at trying to do this across the country for different developments. If developers want to build public trust, they should be doing more of this, basically.
Because it does sort of feel like all of a sudden there's a development and you're like, well, how did that come about? Or why is this happening? We haven't been, informed or
Yeah.
whatever. So it feels like more of that should be done.
Just thinking about other countries, I mean, sometimes it seems like the UK is just one of the most difficult places in the entire world to build infrastructure. And maybe that's just because I live here. But I mean, there was this, it's a bit of a joke really, but there was this project where some rail station in England, and they were trying to build a lift or something, and it's cost like millions and millions. And in the time, it took like years to just like build this lift to the platform. And in that time, China had built like a 200-kilometer railway linking like two major cities. I mean, like, I know that your company works in Sydney as well.
Yeah.
I just wonder if there's any lessons that could be learned from other countries. I mean, I don't know how much you know about China. I feel like maybe it's an unfair example because, I mean, basically it's an authoritarian regime and it can do whatever they want.
Yeah.
But Sydney is possibly, or Sydney/Australia is possibly more analogous to Britain. And I don't know, is there any lessons that they do there that are different to here?
It's still quite difficult to do this in Sydney, in truth. So there's a really good report that was done by an organisation called Create Streets, which it's an architectural firm, but they've got this fascination with trams and light railway systems, which I also have. And what they did in this report was they compared how much a mile of tram track cost in the UK versus Europe versus Australia versus a few countries. And of course, the UK came well out on top. So I don't think that's just the cost of construction is high here. I think it's because the planning approvals and the process of actually getting to putting a spade in the ground is really difficult and more complex than other countries. So I wouldn't look to Australia. I do have an insight into Australia, but it's quite difficult to do infrastructure there. Although in Western Sydney, they've done, and actually in the city itself, they've done the metro in recently, which is a really great piece of infrastructure that it took time, but now that it's built, it's been built, and they're building more lines out into Western Sydney, which will really transform that area. And they're doing it quite quickly. They also just put light rail into the main thoroughfare in Sydney, which has totally transformed that area of the world. But it has taken them time. The slight difference that you've got in maybe housing development there is that it seems to me that the state government is much more involved in actually orchestrating what's going on from a planning perspective, whereas in this country, we have outsourced the building of housing to the private sector, and that means that there's not. I've got my grievances with that. Basically, I think that one of the reasons we don't build enough housing in this country is because private sector developers have no real incentive to do what's necessary.
I mean, it sounds like possibly Australia is
Not Australia. Go and have a look at France and Germany and the European countries. They're the ones that tend to put particularly France. Puts infrastructure in quite quickly. And it's a democracy like the UK, so you can learn more from those European countries than I think you can from China, for instance.
But it is more of a top-down approach, and we get here.
Yeah,
And possibly that's what we need more of.
yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
But even when we have those top-down decisions, and can look back to Heathrow with this, is that the original project was proposed in 2006, 19 years ago, and there have been so many different appeals. And just earlier this year, Rachel Reeve announced that it was definitely go ahead, but obviously there's still no shovels in the ground as yet. Is the system too open to appeal? Once we've made decisions, should we stick to them?
I think so. Yeah, there should be a right of recourse, and if you look at the planning legislation that the government has brought through and the proposed changes to the way that consultation is going to be done on development consent orders, for instance, the government think that as well. So they're looking at measures to limit judicial review, for instance. So, judicial review is a mechanism. It's got its legitimate role, but equally it is a mechanism that's used by community groups to slow down development, right? So, if you get a consent given on a development consent order at the moment, there's that sort of right to a judicial review that takes place within the 6 weeks after the application is consented. And then a judge has to determine whether there is grounds to hear the case. And if the judge says yes, you could be waiting, another year, 2 years for a determination of whether the decision-making process, judicial review is all about the decision-making process, whether that was correct or not. So there has to be some way of making sure that communities have a voice and the right to scrutinise decisions, but also speeding this thing up. And I think the government recognise that, which is why some of the legislation coming through is going to change this.
I've been on the side of it of the local council and a planning committee with there, and I've seen that 6-week window again. If that's not been communicated very well, is a very short window for local communities to get a whole argument together as to.
And it's expensive.
It's expensive. We relies an awful lot on the goodwill of the people involved to make it happen. And we could go on to talk about trust in this as well. Sometimes it feels that a lack of communication is working to the developer's advantage by, being as under the radar as possible.
So so the one thing I would say is it's not the developer's responsibility to communicate out that there's a 6-week period around a judicial review after a decision's made, because the developer doesn't make that decision when we're talking about a planning application. So in that instance, one, the community group sounds like you were quite well mobilised. You probably knew what the legislation was, but also the council should be the one that communicates that out to objectors, that there is that potential opportunity. It's not it's not in the developer's interest to do that, but also why should they?
Well, you say it's not in the developer's interest, but if they are looking to gain the trust and move forwards with the projects, and if we're specifically talking about house builders rather than perhaps infrastructure, and with this one, is that house builders will come along and they'll say as part of projects, we are going to build social housing, there's going to be a nursery school, a medical centre, open space, all this sort of thing. And then it comes along and they build their scheme, and there's a whole load of 4-bedroom houses, which are the premium, their sweet spot as far as getting the payback. And then they run out of money or whatever for the project when it comes to building the social housing and all the other nice bits afterwards. I think the trust in a community for a house builder, as you alluded to earlier, is really poor, and better communication might bridge that trust gap to start with.
In the scenario that you're describing, where a developer might say that a scheme, is no longer viable because of the affordable housing or whatever, I don't think there's any amount of communication that can be done to repair that relationship if a developer's going to come back and look at a scheme again for viability reasons.
I mean, this is conspiracy theory stuff, but
I love a bit of that. Lovely.
but house builders go out with that. They think, right, we'll build our 100 4-bedroom houses, and we know we're going to stop at that sort of thing before they start.
I'm skeptical as to that, to be honest. So I've got my criticism of developers, but generally my experience is that if they submit a planning application for a scheme, the intention is to build out the scheme. So people talk about land banking all the time, this concept that people buy land and just sit on it and wait for the best opportunity to develop it. In reality, every inquiry into whether that happens or not shows that doesn't really happen. What you do have is this concept of absorption rates, which is how much new housing can a community take within any pit, like how much can the market accept at any one time. So say you get planning consent for 350 new homes, you're not going to build 350 new homes in 1 year, one, because it's impractical, but two, because the market wouldn't absorb that amount of housing in any 1 year. So what you can have is a scenario where maybe you deliver 2 or 3 years worth of 50 units per year or whatever it might be, and then the viability of the scheme does change because you've had inflation in construction costs of 50% over that period of time, which, by the way, we've seen in the last few years, particularly in London. The viability of planning applications has been really undermined by several factors, but one of them has been construction inflation. So, developers get a bad rap, and I'm all for bashing them about a bit, despite the fact a lot of them are clients, but they're not totally evil. They are, you can make profit in this sector and also be wanting to build new homes and give people good places to live, right? In my experience.
But the criticisms that people always kind of throw at developers is that they're building hundreds of new homes, but they're always luxury apartments.
Just total and utter nonsense.
I mean, but there are examples of that.
Yeah, I'm sure there are. Every sector's got, an instance of bad behaviour.
But I've heard, for multiple times where there'll be a development and they say, we promise that sort of 30% will be affordable homes. And then it gets to it, and then they actually say, that makes the scheme unviable, and they're halfway through building it. So actually it's going to be more like 10%.
So Jack, I don't work on anecdata. Show me the data
Okay.
that suggests that this is
Well, I'm
a
thinking,
systematic problem, and
Okay.
I'll say, right, okay,
Fair
let's go and address it. So my anecdata is that happens a little bit, but
Yeah.
not a huge amount.
Maybe it's worse around London.
London has had a really, really unique challenge over the last few years around viability of schemes. That land prices are very, very high here. You've had, quite rightly, because of what happened at Grenfell, legislation has come in around fire safety that has pushed up the cost of developing schemes. So what's happened is, people have got planning consents for projects and then had to come back and put second stairwells in, quite rightly, by the way. I'm not saying that that's, and there's all sorts of, so actually the cost of developing has really gone up. So, and developers are not charities at the end of the day. They're private businesses there to make money. So, they're not going to build schemes if there's no profit to be made. It's a highly risky enterprise as well. So London has been particularly challenging. But again, I challenge you, show me the data that's systematic, and we'll come up with a solution.
what about how much flexibility there are in schemes? Maybe there's more in a housing scheme than a big infrastructure type scheme. So in terms of having an open conversation with the communities that are affected by development,
Yeah.
how much can be fed back and actually change the size and scope of a scheme?
It does depend on the scale of the scheme, I tend to find. So bigger master plans, there's usually more up for grabs for the community. So particularly around things like provision of community facilities, or the way that public open space is laid out, the types of activities that you might have on a site, there's a bit more up for grabs on those larger schemes. I think the smaller schemes, it's more difficult because just by virtue of the fact you're working on a smaller site, there's sort of less physical parameters that you can be talking about, but also generally you're more constrained by the commercials or the policy positions. So it's actually quite hard to provide the community with genuine influence on that particular project. But we're always trying to work to find the subtle things that we can include in what I described as that scope of influence earlier. On infrastructure projects, it is much more difficult because it's a highly technical enterprise, but there's always stuff on the margins that can be looked at. So we were talking before we were recording about energy infrastructure, for instance. My sort of theory is that you should have community funds that accrue as a result of the infrastructure that's put in, that should be placed in the hands of the local community to spend in a way they see fit. So that would be one. There's an element of that happens already, and we see a bit of that in Australia, but I think there should be more of that. So you might not be able to influence the actual project, but you might be able to influence the benefits that accrue from that particular project, if that makes sense. So that could be one way of looking at infrastructure, but it is much more difficult on those big infrastructure projects. But in the property sector, if you're clever in terms of bringing forward new housing, you can hand over influence to the community.
Okay. What about, would you say that, and particularly in Britain, we are natural NIMBYs? It always starts as a negative conversation. Nobody wants that change particularly. And the experience I had when I went on a trip about renewable energy, actually, to the Orkneys, was that so many villages there had their own wind turbine, and they were really proud of it. They don't make that much noise after all. There was a complete different attitude to you would find in the home counties, for example. The thought of having a wind turbine over your back garden would be absolutely abhorrent to people in the south. People perceive development as a negative message, when if the whole message was changed to be more positive, and even that basic educational thing about, if you want energy, then you have to suffer the aesthetics a little bit and have the lights switched on.
It's a really good question. So I was involved with a report that a think tank called Demos did. They published it, I think, 2 months ago around this. And they came out with this new phrase, which is MIMBY, which is maybe in my backyard. And they did some opinion polling, and they found, I'm gonna mangle the numbers slightly, so you'd have to double check this, but it was around 62% of people would be classed as MIMBYs, which is they are open to the idea of development in their backyard, but they want to feel like they can help to shape that development and have an input into it. So I don't think we are a country of natural NIMBYs necessarily. I think we're natural MIMBYs. So slightly skeptical, but if things are done correctly, you can bring people on that particular journey. The thing with opinion polling, it's quite interesting because actually when push comes to shove, when you take a development in concept to then translate that into reality, that immediate community around surrounding a particular development project, whether it's infrastructure or housing, I tend to find is quite naturally NIMBY-ish. So it's quite
NIMBY in theory, but NIMBY in practice, almost.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I just want to jump in because I have a big passion about the sort of climate change, and I know the decarbonising the grid, and that all needs to happen, but of course it takes infrastructure. So there's lots of pylons that are being planned, and that's causing lots and lots of protests all over the country because it's seen as a blight on the landscape. I mean, what do we do with it? How do we get to install this and people be okay with it? I know you said before that it's top down, and you're like, well, just get it done. Or how do we get people involved?
It's really, I haven't got the magic bullet on that one, I'm afraid. I really wish I did, because we've been making a lot of money out of it. But
Yeah.
the reality is that you just have to have political leadership on that issue.
Yeah.
If you're going to decarbonise the grid and achieve net zero by 2035 or whatever the current target is, then the government, quite frankly, are going to have to make some tough decisions and upset some people.
Yeah.
That's the cold hard reality of it. And what we're doing now is the sort of easy stuff. What's going to happen, what we'll have to be doing in 5 and 10 years' time is really going to upset people. So, there has to be political leadership.
Yeah, the problem is that it's, Reform just this morning said that they'll go back on all the solar and wind plans, if they come into, power. So then and there'll be people that will support that.
So be it. That's democracy.
Yeah.
And if they win an election and they choose to do that, then that's democracy.
Yeah.
So it's not what I would choose, but we live in a democracy. We don't live in China.
Yeah.
So, but we probably should be a bit more centrally directed in terms of things like decarbonising the grid, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But it goes back to that thing that we've just talked about, which is if communities don't like schemes, that's fine. Is there a way that they can benefit from having a pylon come through their community? Now, that might not assuage them in terms of bringing them on board with the project. That's fine. You just have to accept that's the case. But what I'd like to see is those communities derive some benefit from that project, whether it's free energy or whatever it might be.
They said £250 off their energy bills if you've got a pylon in your backyard.
Right. Okay. Well,
it's the proposed Labour thing, isn't it?
250.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A year, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're communicating on behalf of the broader engineering community here, what about when a project is actually underway? Because what we've really been talking about is getting something up to planning approval stage, but projects go on for a hell of a long time, and the public opinion can vary as that project goes on.
Really good question. So we've got this concept called closing the feedback loop, which is about making sure people understand how they've influenced the project. And then after you've done that and you move into the construction phase, there's literally no excuse now for people in the engineering sector or these big infrastructure projects not to be communicating, because you've got so many channels out there that you can communicate through. There's so much interesting content that you can be putting out. You've got access now to digital twins, 3D modeling, virtual reality, augmented reality, social media platforms. You've got really interesting technologies that can be used to communicate what's happening out to the community, and also not just in terms of like the practical delivery of a project, but also in terms of the social value that's derived from the delivery of these projects through things like construction jobs, or all of the things that these construction companies are doing within communities. All of that should be communicated out because it adds to their bucket of goodwill, in my opinion. So there's literally no excuse not to do it and have a really well executed communications campaign when you're actually putting spades into the ground.
Okay, well, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, our time is up now, so thank you for so eloquently communicating why communication is so important. If you want to contact Ollie or find out more of the work of ECF, then the best starting point is a website, which is engagecf.co.uk. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, there are many more in the series, which you can find in the E+T website, YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcast from. So that's it for today. Thank you for listening, and we hope to have your company in the future. Thank you very much.